Hello, everyone, my colleagues and the members of board. Welcome to another episode of Asia Spotlight. Today, we are privileged to host Dr. S. Fredrick Starr, a distinguished fellow for Eurasia at the American Foreign Policy Council. Dr. Starr's illustrious career includes founding the Central Asia Caucus Institute, serving as a research professor at the Johns Hopkins University, and heading the advisory council at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm. Dr. Starr's expertise lies in the challenges of reopening the continental wide transport through Central Asia and Afghanistan. His influential book, The New Silk Roads, and other policy impacting writings delve into this critical subject. Additionally, Dr. Starr's deep understanding of this region history is evident in his acclaimed work, Lost Enlightenment in Central Asia's Golden Age, which explores the era between 800 and 1200 when the region led the world in trade, economic development, arts, and knowledge. We extend a warm welcome to Dr. S. Frederick and eagerly anticipate gaining insights into his extensive knowledge and experiences. Now, without any further delay, I would like to invite Professor Amogh Rai, Research Director, Asia, to moderate the session from here.
Professor Starr, with your consent and for your agreeing to do this very early in the day, thanks a lot. So Asia Spotlight is a series of conversations that we have with people who are uniquely privileged to have a point of view on an area or a subject of expertise in a particular context around the continent of Asia. And I think for Central Asia, there is nobody else who can do it better than you can. So with your permission, and we are recording it to later put it on YouTube. And this recording, before we put it on YouTube, we will send it to you so that if you would want to make any changes, we'll do it. And now with your permission, I would like to get into the conversation.
Bravo, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So for people who are joining us later or will be seeing this book for the first time, this is Lost Enlightenment. I've had this copy for around a decade now. I think I remember buying it when it came out in 2014. That was the first Indian edition, if I'm not wrong. And I've been carrying this book through a lot of places. I've been carrying it in some of my travels, which have skirted around Central Asia. They've never quite managed to go to Central Asia. And one of the things that I always wanted to ask you, there is a lot of confusion around Central Asia. In fact, you had to write a paper on it in 2008. It's a policy paper called In Defense of Greater Central Asia. So now that we have you here, what exactly is Central Asia? And where is this thing?
That's a great question and an important one, because the term actually is quite new. It was proposed by President Akayev because, of course, this had previously been a colonial territory of the Russian Empire, and therefore the definition that existed with the collapse of the USSR consisted only of those regions that had been under Soviet and Russian rule. And that means 5 states: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. Kazakhstan. But that is a very recent, and if I can say, colonial definition. If you ask, though, is there a cultural definition? That's what I started with. Is there a cultural zone that we could call and should call Central Asia? Well, there is. And at the very least, in addition to those 5 states that I just mentioned, you have to include Afghanistan, which for 3,000 years has been absolutely integral part of Central Asia. And so there's no question about that. Then beyond that, things get a little more interesting. the very eastern zone of Iran, the very eastern, called Khorasan, that belongs in the same cultural zone. And let us be blunt, so does a great deal of Xinjiang in China, which was, at the time Mao's Red Army took it over, was 98% Turkic and Muslim. So leave politics aside, it belongs as part of the same cultural zone. Okay, that gets us a much bigger area and more significant. The next question is, what defines it? And that's what my book is all about.
So in your book, one of the things that keeps on coming up is the contest between the Arabs, Central Asia, the region, and the regional identities. But one of the things that is very interesting is the very nature of most of these things being on the move, always, sort of a caravan network, always on the move, always nomadic, almost, largely nomadic, but also striving for civilization. How did the nomadic people actually achieve so much as recounted in the book?
Well, first of all, we have to understand there are two very different civilizational types interacting intimately across this region. One were indeed the nomadic peoples, who tended to be Turkic, and the settled urban people, who in the early days, up to around the 10th century, were mainly Persianate. Not Persian, not Iranian, but Persianate. The way we would say Holland is, the Dutch have a Germanic language, it's not German. Okay, we have these two interacting civilizational types, nomadic and urban. And that really is what was unique and distinctive, because the nomadic people protected and secured the great trade routes that went in every direction, whereas the urban people manufactured the goods. We think of the so-called Silk Road as mainly in terms of transport, but no, it was in fact the center of production. The Central Asians were massive producers of cloth, of metals, of very high quality iron, and so on, all of which was exported on these trade routes, which were protected by the nomads.
But my question is also to do with, because something that the book kind of gets into, other people, the sheer cast of characters, so much so that, like, in a long historical novel, one has to, you give a dramatis personae before the book begins. And it is quite extensive. You have to keep on going in and you have to keep on going back. 3 people stand out. 2 people you start the book with. And in fact, your 2023 book is also largely around these 2 people. One of the most important things that we take for granted is libraries. So what I'm also trying to understand, because there must be a lot of sources that must have not come in the book, how did these knowledge networks survive the constant movement? And how did it create a civilizational ethos, which was to influence the Asian civilizations, the Western civilizations? And yet, today, you know about the Arabs, but you do not know about the impact that the Central Asians made to the Arabs. But you know about the Arabs that they made to the European civilization. How did the knowledge network persist, this constant change?
This is a very challenging question, and obviously I don't have a definitive answer. And if we can raise the question and make it a real one, that's a success in itself. But I would suggest this, that the amazing incredibly fertile and productive and innovative, even genius civilization that was created in Central Asia for several centuries, that this worked to the beautifully because it was protected by a big complex network of trade in every single direction. We tend to think of it as, say, Silk Road. Well, we think of China, we think of Europe. No, the main route on the Silk Road was to India. That was longer, it was more heavily traveled, never interrupted, whereas the China route, although it was very important on silk, but even that route wasn't that deep, because the Central Asians said, wait a minute, we can raise mulberry trees too, and they started making the silk cheaper and better. So most of the silk that arrived in Europe from Central Asia was actually Central Asian. So anyway, this complex trade network created wealth. It created wealth in cities, and among the wealthy in the city were some very highly civilized families who brought up their sons, I have to say. I don't, rare exception, women as well, but they brought up their sons with tremendous sophistication. And so that is really what created this boom. It was commercial wealth, if you will, that was translated into education, which was translated into innovation. And that persisted really, not, people say, well, how long did it last? And the fashionable answer is, well, down to the Mongols. But even before the Mongols, it was being attacked from the side of the ultra-Orthodox Muslims. That most of the people I write about were themselves Muslims, but of very moderate character. Whereas the split in Islam between Sunni and Shia absolutely tore apart this region, because once the Sunni got control through the Seljuks, they really, this unleashed a cultural war, and that deeply damaged the extraordinary cultural profusion that had existed heretofore.
Right. So I'm now going to sort of ask you to take a leap away from the book. And there is something that when you start the book, you thank the Soviet Union and the Russian historians for keeping the area alive. And this is a common refrain when you look at the archives, which opened up briefly after the end of the Soviet Union, of the sheer amount of work that was put by the early Russian historians under the imperial rule, and then Soviet Union, and then even extending to perhaps early years of Vladimir Putin. Would you say that the Russians were the only one to a certain extent, because you make it very clear in places apart from the book that this is an area which has never been conquered, which has never been conquerable, because there's been a lot that has always happened. Would you say that the Russians, with their deep understanding of the area, to a certain extent, were able to manage the multiple identities better?
Well, in one sense, yes. If you include in that management the use of raw force. In 1916, for example, the Russian government, the Tsarist government, fighting World War I, wanted to mobilize the male population of Central Asia to fight in Europe. And there was a massive, massive rebellion that caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, and the flight of tens of thousands of Kyrgyz into China. And that wasn't the only area of conflict. So I would say that all the outsiders, beginning with the Arabs, who conquered this area had to use force, and in both of those cases, Arab and Russian, you could, and I'd say Mongol too. After the initial conquest, there were important cultural achievements, but they were built on raw force and the loss of thousands and thousands of lives, and which explains why the Central Asians themselves are so eager to have self-government. They want to rule themselves, and not just as a group of separate states, but to link arms, and that is happening as we talk today.
And this actually up to this opens it up to the question of not just identity, but also at the end of it all, when you kind of talk about Central Asia, you are talking about, in a sense, about the Islamic age and the rise of Islam in this part of the world. Although a lot of the features of the pre-Islamic civilizations are incorporated in, even after the conquest by Islam, let's put it like that. And yet, when one is talking about the achievements of the Arab world or the Islamic sciences, why is it that a large part of the Islamic canon or the researchers from Egypt, from Iraq, from Iran, I'm talking all pre-1950s, pre-1970s, they preclude the Central Asian achievements? Is it because of the dichotomy of Islam?
Well, that is a subject for many further books by people more expert than me. But I would say the following, that there is not a single Islam viewed from a Central Asian perspective. There is, on the one hand, the armed and militant one, which conquered the whole region and absolutely destroyed whole libraries, whole cultures. Biruni, the great scientist of the 10th century, records how the entire literature and national library of Khwarazm, where he was from, this major civilization, was utterly destroyed by the Arab conquest. There's that, and then if you take later, Mahmud of Ghazni, this was a monster. Look what he did in India. My goodness, what is now Pakistan and Western India. It was pillage and rape. I mean, he hauled hundreds of thousands of women back to be slaves and men to serve in the army, and killed, just slaughtered people. So you have that Islam, all done in the name of the faith. On the other hand, then you have people like those who I highlight in both books, who were intensely civilized, who had a deep respect for all knowledge, no matter what its source, and who asked all the questions that serious people everywhere have always asked. And they came up with many absolutely original answers to those questions. So are you going to say one is Islam and not the other? Well, maybe. Or do you want to say that life is complex and people are complex and contradictory?
Yes. Well, I am not a scholar of Islam, so I'm going to let this seep in.
Let that one pass.
And think more about it. But in the sort of, so your book is very interesting because it just weighs slightly under a kilogram, but it carries a lot of intellectual weight. I actually checked on Amazon today, 936 grams to be precise. But but one of the things is that throughout the book, one gets a sense of two kinds of thinkers. One are sort of innovators, and the other are traditionalists. Essentially, and it's very hard at times to assign a scholar in one camp or the other camp. But one very interesting aspect of all of this, and something that is hiding in the shadows here, is an area of interest for me. That's China. You say that Xinjiang, and you kind of make references to it throughout the book, that the Chinese could really not care to control Xinjiang till very, very late in the day, which is now. But the most prolific people who came out in this area, they are all from an area which is very close to China. Was there a huge impact of the Cynic civilization on Central Asia, which goes unrecorded? Or am I reading too much into it?
That's an important question. My impression is that in the last generation, where the great romanticism about the Silk Road has arisen, and many books, and many of them very good, about that trade, it has had the effect of overemphasizing the role of China and turning Central Asia into the sort of passive recipient. But we forget that the Central Asians influenced the Chinese in fundamental ways. For example, all those instruments that we play like this, with plucked instruments and bowed instruments, those originated in Central Asia, not in China. And there are many, many other examples. And Mr. Needham, in his glorious, glorious work, English scholar, has massive amounts of information on this. So I think we have to, I think we have overstated the impact of China and grossly understated the impact of Indian culture on Central Asia. This was there from the beginning. All of Central Asia was Buddhist at one point. This all came up from India, of course, the Indian subcontinent, what is now Pakistan. And the influences went in both directions, of course. But that interaction, which, as I said earlier, was based on trade, which was more intense, more continuous than the trade with China, that interaction, I think, was the most fertile interaction they had, along with the interaction with the Middle East, which was also of long-standing and intense intellectually as well as economically. So what I'm saying is that the Central Asians were like spiders at the middle of the web. They were smart people, and they understood there was money to be made by trading in every direction, but they also understood that there was wisdom to be gained from all these people that they traded with, whether all the way around the circle, the Byzantines, the Byzantine Christians on the west, the Syrian Christians on the west, the Arabs, the Muslim Arabs, and then the what is today Iran, the rest of Persia, then all the way down to the vast Indian subcontinent, and then up to China. They interacted with all of them, borrowed from all of them, but contributed to all of them.
That's a very interesting. There's a scholar who's written 2 phenomenal books on Silk Road, and that's an interesting way of looking at it. But I'm again going to bring you to contemporary, because my job here is to shift between the book and contemporary matters. Because you just said that about the Indian continent, the Indian subcontinent, the Chinese influence. So 3 years after your book comes out, President Xi Jinping has a dream about getting the Silk Road band back together. Let's put it like that. And then it kind of settles on Belt and Road Initiative after multiple name changes. So there was that hiccup. But now we have the BRI. We have the Japanese trying to have Japan plus Central Asia initiative. We have multiple initiatives from Russia, which is now weakening because of the Ukrainian war and what has just happened with Azerbaijan. And I think that is also going to have an impact in Central Asia. But in all of this, an interesting organization comes up, which is the Organization of Turkic States. And the Organization of Turkic States has most of the Central Asian members. It is, if one is reading your book and were to do away with the dates and look at the constant buying of attention that is happening in Central Asia, it would read more like a newspaper and less like a history book. Because a lot of what you're saying, the constant attention grabbing or constant trying to get into Central Asia, get people around together, all of that is happening. What are these political formations that keep Central Asia in the picture, while at the same time keeping it relegated to one side of global discussions? Because when you say geopolitics, Central Asia is there somewhere, but it's only as an afterthought. So what is
Why
happening?
is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the right question. Let me reformulate all this information about these various external initiatives in terms of and internal initiatives in terms of one simple alternative. Do you organize this region from without, or does it organize itself from within? The entire imperial history, Russian conquest, was that we can organize you better from outside than you can yourself from inside. And but now we have to understand there is a web of external powers. It began with right after the collapse of the USSR. Japan was very early in the game, by the way, providing much appreciated emergency relief against landslides and earthquakes and stuff like that. But then everyone else got in. There's a Korean exchange constantly at the presidential level. Japan, the Europeans do, the Americans do, C5+1. The Indians do, all do. Of course, the Chinese initiative 10 years ago looked very promising. It's a lot more complicated today, as we know. And then you have, as you rightly mentioned, the Turkic initiative. Now, on that one, I think it's positive. I think all these are positive. I don't think it's smart of the Turks to define this in ethnic terms for two reasons. One is that it tells everyone else, namely the Tajiks and a lot of the Afghans, that you're not Central Asia. You're not real because you're not Turks. Well, I'm sorry, that doesn't make sense in the modern world. A purely narrow ethnic definition. They should lift that and embrace the whole region. But back to the main issue, is it to be organized from without or from within? Now, what has been grossly underreported at the international level, East, West, North, and South, is the efforts by the Central Asians themselves to create something akin to what we know as ASEAN in Asia, or the Nordic Council, or whatever. It is the only, because of colonial control, it is the only region of the world without its own internal structure, owned by the member states, controlled by them, and excluding others. But their efforts in this direction have been steady, very subtle, and very effective. And it's based now, interestingly, on a recognition of their multi-ethnic cultural affinities. And that gets us back to Lost Enlightenment, of course, because it is this which they share, a great and deep history.
Right. And this is actually one of the things that keeps an active reader of the book very engaged in the discussion. Because when you go back today, and you just kind of pointed about the multiple layers that have come up since the Enlightenment and the lost in that bit, how do we now study this part? I mean, how do you go to a country where you can see the ruins of a great civilization, but how do you get them to talk about it? And this is a question in two parts. A, it's a question of how do you study it? Because you make it very clear that you wrote the book because there was no other book that could have given you this snapshot of this time or this area. And you would want a Joseph Needham to come along and write 27 volumes or perhaps more, like Joseph Needham did for China. But A, how do you do it? And B, we hear about decolonization. I mean, in my country, India, decolonization is a constant process. A lot keeps on happening. But when one thinks about Central Asia, and when you encounter students who are coming in from Central Asia to universities abroad, be it in India, be it in the United Kingdom, be it in the United States, they are all speaking Russian. I mean, at least one of their languages is Russian. They would have had some sort of scholarship from Russia. So how do you work back to this area of lost enlightenment? What are the governments doing there to kind of get a hold on what they used to be at a point of time?
Well, this is point zero. Who are we? For the Central Asians themselves, they're not puzzling over this. They've got it. They increasingly they're successfully rediscovered who they really are, and they're discovering in that process that there is a bigger we than just our immediate community of our political nation. That it has a regional character. So they are not trying, by the way, to abolish nation states, but rather to create a kind of second floor, which reflects and works with their commonalities. That is actually happening, but it won't take place overnight. It has to ultimately affect the education system. It has to reflect transportation, the interaction of human interaction between these countries was very little after the collapse of the USSR. Now it's rapidly growing, and you see license plates from all the other countries in all the respective capitals. So this is all very positive, but there's big negative. And the big negative is that the huge impact of Russian imperial control of Central Asia was to cut off the region from the south. So all transport, all communication went north through Russia. Now that's all changed. That's no longer the case. You can go east to China. You can go increasingly. You can go west as well across the Caspian to Europe, to Turkey, and to Europe. However, the key door to the south, to the Indian subcontinent, to Southeast Asia remains closed. And their highest priority is to open that door. Otherwise, they're going to be controlled by their they're landlocked countries. Uzbekistan is double landlocked. That's a really punishment. And so to overcome their landlocked status, over 3,000 years, they looked south as well as west and east and north. But the southern window, it should be our highest priority, help them to do that. That means making some sort of a deal with the Taliban to build a railroad across Afghanistan. Otherwise, the only transport south will be via China, or through Russian routes, and they want their own, which would be the most direct, which would be through Afghanistan, and that requires some cooperation between India and Pakistan, of course, but it also requires focus on the international level on the absolute importance of that southern window. I'm surprised, frankly, that India hasn't made it that its holy cause. It's not against anyone, it is for the Central Asians.
I think one of the reasons for that could be that Central Asia has always been seen as a sphere of influence of the wider playing ground of Russia. And I think now with this war that Russians are perpetrating on the Ukrainians, and perhaps after that, this conversation is going to open up. But that brings me to a very interesting question, that is Pakistan part of Central Asia or not? Because if the 5 stands are taken into consideration and you take Afghanistan, then there is the 7th stand, which is Pakistan. So does Pakistan make the cut or not?
Well, let me complicate your question and ask, is any part of India part of Central Asia? And I would say, yes, there is an inner Central Asia that consists of the 5 former Soviet republics, Afghanistan, Xinjiang. That is, I'm defining it culturally. There is also, however, a further sphere of Central Asian impact, cultural and interaction in both directions, which covers a good part of the southern zone of Pakistan and also northwestern India. I would say, how can, if you take the 7 cities of Delhi, how many of them were related to Central Asia?
Around 6 of them.
And this is a major cultural zone, and in a big sense. And India, I think, has been slow to embrace this. Maybe the Pakistan issue has prevented it, but Indian business people are very savvy. And I think if they were to put their minds to it, they'd solve this transport problem overnight. They tried to do it through the Iranian port of Chabahar, which they strongly supported. But it seems to me there is an interest for the Central Asians. They want 2 ports to the south. They want Chabahar, which is in Iran, and they also want Gwadar, which is in Pakistan. Why? They want them to compete, drive down prices. The Gwadar port is actually closer for India. So maybe there is, in this opening this big window to the south and from the south, maybe there's a real possibility of very interesting and productive economic and cultural innovation from the side of India. Why not?
That could be an interesting a paper that we work on as a think tank. So
I think so. And let's be clear. You're not starting with a tabula rasa. You are starting with an extremely deep and rich legacy, going back thousands of years. A Georgian scholar who lived out his life in Uzbekistan, an archaeologist, wrote a wonderful book called the Great India Road, and this was the key to the so-called Silk Road. Reopen it. Everyone wins. It's not against anyone.
So, okay, that was a great answer to a very confused question. Thank you very much for that. But I'm going to now get back to the book. One iconic thing in the book is the scholars, and there is a veritable phalanx of them. They keep on coming in. And one has to wonder, how did they manage to stand against religion, which was at that point of time still trying to find its dogma, but was pretty convinced about how it was to look at the world. So, how did the Central Asian identity help its scholars defy the caliphs? Because there is a constant pressure, as one can see from the earlier sections of your book, where the caliphs sitting far away are trying to get them to do something. But the scholars, the people, and because you need Central Asians to govern Central Asia, they're able to get out of it completely. So, why did they do it? Why was it not easier to just give up and follow what the standard Islamic protocol said for the rest of the world? Because they just stand out against the tide.
Yes, there was, of course, there was a deep stream in the Muslim world which said that the only basis for truth is the Quran and the Hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet, and that everything that you need answers to can be found in those two sources, period. There is no other source of absolute truth. That what happened in Central Asia was that over many centuries, they explored and analyzed other sources of truth. And how did this happen? It happened because they, thanks to their contacts with the West, they got a hold of a big part of the legacy of ancient Greece, Greek intellectual law, especially Aristotle. By the way, they didn't get Aristotle's politics. A huge loss that they didn't, but that's another issue. They got a hold of the Greek texts because Syrian Christians, who were themselves Arabs, knew both the Greek language and Arabic and translated them into Arabic, which the educated Central Asians had access to. So they got that huge body of literature, but it was itself contradictory. There were two sources, very different sources of absolute firm knowledge. One, according to Greek, to Aristotle, was logic, syllogism. If you can establish truth through logic and the syllogism. The other was also traced to ancient Greek thought, and that is mathematics. If you can't count it, it doesn't exist. It's not real. I can prove things through math. Now, the fact that they inherited and developed both of these trends to the nth degree, and that's why I wrote a book on Biruni and Ibn Sina, who epitomized these two trends. This meant that even while the intellectuals were pushing aside those who were the dogmatists, who were saying the only source of truth is the Quran and the Hadiths, there was also a tension among the intellectuals, which helped stir the soup and made it all that much more intense and lively and innovative and interesting. But another word about the dogmatists. This is Bukhari, again, a Central Asian, Imam Bukhari, who did the most formidable collection of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, that's a very strange document to a non-Muslim if you read the Hadiths, because it covers absolutely everything that you can imagine, and sometimes in rather unlikely and even bizarre ways, while at the same time making some very important statements and truths which anyone would recognize, and way beyond the Muslim world. But the key was that this is all based on authority. And it's not based on reason. It's not based on logic. It's not based on mathematics. It's based on authority. That was the fundamental issue of the great enlightenment of Central Asia. And that is the discovery of logic, the discovery of mathematics, and their impact on human thought.
That has been one of the most rewarding things about reading this book. And I am going to come to your 2023 book, because although I have not read it yet, I recently discovered that that book has come out, and I've just ordered it, and it's going to take some time to be delivered. But in this cast of glorious scholars, innovators, thinkers, syncretic thinkers, most of them. For example, I discovered India by Al-Biruni because of your book. I had no idea.
A magnificent book, by the way, a magnificent book.
And how did that person kind of do it? Because the person who was doing it under was not exactly a man of upstanding moral characters. So
maybe call him a gangster. Mahmud of Ghazni.
Yes. And that person kind of creates a court language, creates amazing scholars under him, and yet was perhaps one of the most destructive people. But two people who stand as the archvillains in your book, if we were to think of it in a novel, are going to be, and I would want to understand more about them, because they kind of are interesting for what they managed to do before the Mongols arrived on the scene. Nizam al-Mulk and al-Ghazali. What prompted them to go and be a bull in a china shop?
Well, there are partisans of Ghazali who would say he was not a bull in a china shop, but that's another matter. Ghazali, he appears in my history as for his absolute frontal and very rational attack on Ibn Sina, Avicenna, which he did a half a century after Avicenna's death. But he basically concluded that Avicenna could not have been a Muslim, viewing with his views, and that the normal punishment for apostasy is death. That's pretty rough stuff. Now, what was going on? Ghazali was at this point, and he was a young man, very ambitious, very smart, and he was drawn into the Sunni-Shia fight after the Seljuks basically took over the entire region. He was working for the ideological leader of the Seljuks, and his job was to wipe out the Shia, the Sunnis. The Shiites. His job was to wipe them out, and therefore he made this frontal attack on Ibn Sina, not accusing him of being a Shiite, but as epitomizing the kind of thought that had to be extinguished. Now, interestingly, Ghazali did this. He was a very smart guy. He did this in a very systematic and thorough way. And he actually, while he caricatured Ibn Sina's thoughts, ultimately, he nonetheless portrayed it in some detail. So successfully did he do so that over the next centuries, many thinkers who didn't read Ibn Sina directly because they couldn't get a hold of his works, they read Ghazali on Ibn Sina and became either partisans of Ibn Sina or critics of him on the basis of Ghazali. So So he played a creative role too, unintentionally. However, overall, his attack on Ibn Sina and on reason, and as Ibn Sina expressed it, had an unfortunate and enduring impact throughout the region.
And he still continues to enjoy a sort of celebrity status within certain parts of the Islamic world.
Absolutely.
And does that also reflect on why Central Asia is not that celebrated part of, say, the Islamic countries? Because when you think about Islam, Central Asia is not one of the places that comes up.
Well, yes, exactly. The problem is this, that if you're sitting in Arab capital or in Tehran, or in Turkey, they've all three fallen prey to the same malady. They all three are tempted to look at all Central Asia as our little brothers. Yeah, hence you have the Turkic Union, which should, not the Turks don't acknowledge that the Turks who came to Turkey came from Central Asia. The Arabs don't acknowledge that some of their greatest thinkers in the Arabic, who wrote in the Arabic language, were Central Asians. The Iranians, and I'm not saying Persians, today's Iranians want to subsume all Central Asia under Iran's cultural guidance, even though the Central Asians rightly say, wait a minute, we were ourselves the center, not the suburbs of intellectual suburbs of Iran. And let us remind you, we are basically Sunni. We are basically Sunni, and most of you are Shia in Iran, and so please don't mix us up. But all three of these great cultures of the West, of the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, Arabs, all of them make the mistake of dismissing Central Asia as their provincial little brothers.
And if I may, you're not a scholar of Arabic. You started, if I'm not wrong, you are a Russian speaker. So you've access to the Russian archives. You have
German, French.
Sorry?
German, French, English.
And Russian. But one of the stars in your book, if I might be excused for saying that, are the Persians, or the Persianate speaking empire. I don't speak Russian. So what I'm trying to understand is, how are they referred to in the archives, the Russian archives? Because Russia and Persia have been at loggerheads for a long time when it comes to controlling Central Asia. And control, of course, is within air quotes, because it's a very hard thing.
The study of the Persianate peoples of Central Asia has gone on in a lot of places, certainly Germany, France, United States, very, very significant. And they're first-class scholars of this region in India today, and there have been in Pakistan as well. Interestingly, the Russians who studied this and did excellent work in the 30s, 40s, 50s, especially, and then it tended to fade out after the 60s. Many of them were Jewish, and they did this as this was a safe study. They didn't want to get involved with politically sensitive stuff where they'd get in big trouble. Central Asia presented was a safe zone, and they did so with a certain amount of sympathy, if you will, a deep sympathy, because there had always been, and this is going back to ancient times, a Jewish presence in Central Asia, as well as Afghanistan, part of Central Asia. So I think the archives, there are amazing archives in many parts of the world on this region. Russians have some, but those tend to be the political archives from the 19th and 20th century, the imperial empire. But if you go, for example, some major texts of this era are to be found in Scotland, in England, in Germany, in Turkey. My goodness, the Turkish archives are a gold mine. In Egypt and in India. And so I think there is still hope, even though we have today only a quarter of what these geniuses actually wrote. There is still hope that we may find some more.
How hopeful are you about that, seeing the winds of change? I mean, I was reading an interview of yours from 2003, 2004, when Taliban had just gone out, and you had warned about writing it off just yet. Now we're in 2023, 20 years later. Taliban is back in power. The sort of rage against a version of moderate Islam seems to go on and on. So how hopeful are you about Central Asia in the future, 50 years?
I'm very hopeful. First of all, the other 5 countries of Central Asia, and I would, by the way, increasingly add Azerbaijan to that list, they're all doing fine. They're building new universities. They're doing all the right things. They're making mistakes. Who doesn't? But their progress is impressive and increasingly acknowledged. What about Afghanistan? I think history doesn't end. And I think we grossly underestimate the competence and numbers and energies of a whole generation of young Afghan men and women, many of whom left and are to be found, among other places, in India, in the United States, in Europe, in the Middle East. These are very talented people, and they're not going to disappear. Furthermore, there is a fundamental tension within Afghanistan between the mullahs in the south and Kandahar, the guys with the big beards, who want to control everything, and the actual ministers of state who are trying to run a government and keep the peace, who are in Kabul. Now, the Kabul guys spent a year or 2 or 3 sitting in the Middle East, so they know how the modern world lives. And they know that their public knows that too, increasingly, thanks to the internet. So they've got to deliver. Seems to me that out of this is going to be a deepening tension. And ultimately, I think the guys in Kandahar are going to have to yield a good deal of authority, or the regime won't survive. So I'm optimistic. I think the modern world can't just be walled off successfully forever. That doesn't work. There's a lot happening in Afghanistan today. I think it's very much in the interest of India, certainly of Pakistan, certainly of Turkey, United States, et cetera, to take an interest in this. This isn't to excuse the horrendous stuff that the Taliban government has done, but it is to identify issues on which their progress or failure can be can be studied and acted upon. And I think increasingly we will find that there's more prospects for interaction there than we think.
This brings me, because I'm also conscious of the fact that I don't want to take too much of your time. So at any point of time, if you think that I've taken too much of your time, please let me know.
I'm going to move so I'm out of the sun.
Right.
Beautiful sunny day here.
Right. So I'm now going to start and going towards opening it up to some people who are here as well. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you last two questions. And so my second last question would be, do you think that with the waning of the influence of Russia in some manner, perhaps not fully in the next 2 to 3 years, there would be more and more opening up of the 5 Central Asian states and them coming out of their shell and not being dependent on, say, the Russian view of the world or the Chinese view of the world or any other view of the world, but coming to terms as democracies and political powers in their own right, and rediscovering, as you said, that they have rediscovered their heritage, but also acting on it, letting in more and more freedom so that people can question more and get back to being another enlightenment. Let's put it like that.
Well, as the Central Asians would say, inshallah. Let us hope so. But let me point out something which Indians and Americans should understand best of all. Both our countries are emerged from colonial rule. and in our earlier days, earliest post-colonial days, our first concern was the preservation and protection of sovereignty. Everything was subordinated to that. And a lot of what we may now consider negative or even silly things were done in the name of preserving sovereignty. Same with the Central Asians. They locked themselves in. They were very took a very narrow and intolerant approach to all outside influences if they didn't support their sovereignty. Well, they've succeeded. These states exist, even the most ones with the greatest difficulties, like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. They exist and they are sovereign and they are not going to disappear, and they know that. So what's happening is that they're building a second story on this sovereignty. And they're saying, wait a minute, we're not just a small isolated country in the middle of nowhere. We are part of a major, important, and historically rich cultural zone. They are affirming this themselves. And out of this is going to come their new position in the world and new independence. They are very, very subtle in their ability to grasp when they are being manipulated and when they have to be cautious. They're very, very effective at identifying steps which, in fact, support regional sovereignty and regional self-rule, and building on those, even while they're not crowing about it internationally. They're just doing it. These are competent and subtle people, and I think they have a brilliant future.
Thank you. I mean, that would be great to kind of, if that particular time could come back, and hopefully it would, as you said. That brings me to my last question before I open it up. In the 2023 book that has just come out, you picked up 3 people to focus on out of a cast of characters from your previous book that came out a decade before. Why these 3 people?
Well, they're By the third, I assume you're taking Mahmud of Ghazni. You know, the core issue for all our intellectual life as human beings is, what is the basis of truth? What is truth? And I was drawn to Ibn Sina and to Biruni because in the end of the day, they came to very different conclusions on this, both of which are defensible in terms of the thinking mind, the thinking human being. And they were absolute opposites. And the reason versus logic and versus mathematics. Well, it turned out these two guys knew each other. They interacted with each other. They couldn't stand each other either. They were dramatically different personalities. Ibn Sina was a good old boy. He loved to, he drank and hooped it up and had a very rich private life, which is not the subject of any memoirs because it was largely suppressed. He also was a civil servant, and a whole career of his we know nothing about because not a single paper of his. He was the equivalent of a minister of state for many, many, many years. Biruni, on the other hand, was an introvert. He didn't like to socialize. He stuck to his work. But the main difference was that Biruni, all of Biruni's research and writing and thinking was tentative. This is where I am right now. You read his stuff and you think you're reading a modern research report. He will tell you what is needed next in each report. Whereas Ibn Sina, exactly the opposite. By golly, he wanted to get things down as truth. This is it. You can then move on to the next issue. Again, it's the juxtaposition of these two geniuses, and both of them were, that attracted me, and which I think warrants a much greater place for both of them in our picture of world history and life.
The third person, you're of course correct, because the third person does make an entry and exit throughout the pages because of the sheer chaos he ended up causing the world over. Professor Starr, it has been fascinating. Thank you, first and foremost, for giving us the time. And now I'm going to be opening it up to the people who are ahead. We're going to take another 15 to 20 minutes maximum of yours, and then we're going to close it. Hopefully, this has not been a very erratic discussion for you. So with that, I'm just going to open it up, and we already have 2 questions for you. Do I have your permission to go ahead and ask you these?
Please.
Right. So the first question is from my young colleague Farheen. What role did women play during the golden age of Central Asia?
What
role did women play during the golden
women? Whoa, an important question.
Very, yeah.
The answer is we don't know. We know what they didn't do, but what we don't know is what they did do. In Ibn Sina's great 5-volume, massive tome on medicine, there's a good deal about the medical concerns of females. There were women poets. There was a woman in what is now Afghanistan, Rabia, who wrote wonderful verse, and that is preserved. And there are some women who actually got involved among the nomadic peoples. My goodness, there were women who were playing very prominent roles. But their story would take a lot more research into a lot more places to ferret out the little information that remains. So I'm sorry that this is largely a story that has yet to be told, if it can be told.
Right. Thank you. I have question number 2 for you. That is from Neethi. I think she's been sending you emails. So how did the cultural interaction and exchanges between different civilizations in Central Asia influence the various forms of cultural expression during the period covered in your book?
The answer is intensely. The people I write about were deep-dyed cosmopolitans. They were citizens of the entire globe intellectually, so far as they could get information. They were omnivores, and therefore, if they heard that there was even a possibility of learning something new about some unknown place, they seized on it. Read Biruni's book about India. It's an astonishing thing. He was just desperate to collect every shred of information he could. So a delegation of Chinese showed up in Ghazni in Afghanistan, where Biruni was living, and he debriefed them on trying to figure out the longitude and latitude of the towns they were from. These people were omnivores, and when the interest in the first works from ancient Greek were translated into Arabic, as I said, largely by Syrian Christians, who, by the way, reached India. We forget that in the 7th century. But when the first books translated from Greek into Arabic hit Central Asia, they went crazy. And they were all over the issue. So you had the bishops, Syrian Christian bishops, all over sponsoring translation. Then you had some great Buddhist convert families, people who had been Buddhists but converted because they wanted to play in the new big leagues of world politics. They were sponsoring translations. Translations were popping up all over the place. And why do I mention this? Because it shows they knew no boundaries in their inquisitiveness. And hats off to them.
Right. There was also an earlier message from Mr. Nard. He had to leave because he had to go for a dinner. So that was message. And I think I get an opportunity to ask you one last question, because your scholarship has exhausted the people who are on the call. So I get to ask you one last question, and I'm thankful for that. In all of this, the war, the schisms, the chaos that we covered throughout all of this, what was that one bit of sort of, because you talk about cultural expression in the book, you talk about different cultural expressions that keep on popping up. What was the most important embodiment of art for people of Central Asia? Because there was the Buddhist influence, there was the Islamic influence, there was some influence from India. What would be a cultural artifact from Central Asia?
There are many. And by the way, the physical artifacts they are to be found in museums and collections from Japan to South America to North America, Europe, Middle East, everywhere. And fortunately, there's a new organization in Uzbekistan that was founded by Firdevs Abduhalakov, which is seeking not to collect these. They're not demanding them back. They're photographing and studying and issuing gorgeous books on all these. So I think the body of physical artifacts that reflect the amazing achievements of Central Asian culture, that is right now being greatly expanded. And I think there are going to be some surprises there. However, let me suggest that one of the greatest monuments to the spirit of this region is to be found in the poet Rudaki. Read his poetry. It's well translated into English, into German and French. Read it. Why? Because here you immediately realize he's one of us, and that he's not from a different world. He's a human being in the fullest sense of the word, and it's charming, it's engaging, it's wise. It has pathos. It has all the natural and good human emotions. I would say, therefore, yes, look at the miniature paintings. Yes, look at the pottery. Yes, look at the architecture, by the way, which isn't preserved, most of it, because they built out of mud brick. Whereas you go to India, everything's gloriously preserved because they built out of stone. But I think, putting all that aside, I would point just to Rudaki as a charming, interesting, engaging, and lovable poet. Alas, we know very little about Central Asian music, which everyone at the time said was at the same level. And Rudaki accompanied all his poems. He sang them and he accompanied them on a lute.
Yes, and if I'm not wrong, you're also associated with the Uzbeki enterprise in getting all of the things together, the cultural.
Yes, I've been trying to be of whatever use I can to that effort. I think this is going on all over the region. It's not just in Uzbekistan. The Kazakhs are doing the same, the Tajiks, everyone. And this is very positive. They are basically asking, who are we and what do we have from the entire past that will help us in that inquiry? Very positive.
Right. And one of your other, well, pretty well known to everybody else is that you're also a jazz musician. So at some point of time, perhaps a book on music of Central Asia.
I wish, yes, I am a musician, and that's an extremely important part of my life. But here's the problem. The earliest recordings that tell us what they actually were doing are only from the beginning of the 20th century. There's nothing recorded earlier. And there are a couple of obscure scholars who have claimed to have cracked the code of notating early compositions in Central Asia. I'm not closely familiar with their work. I know it exists. However, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to have there the kind of exposition of glorious early music that you see in Europe today. Unfortunate. I see the same problem exists in India. You have some of the instruments, the old instruments, and that tells you something. But what is lost is notation.
Right. And on that note, thank you very much for doing it. It has been an educational experience for just about everybody who joined. And hopefully we've not taken up too much of your time. So when all of this is processed, we're going to send it back to you for your approval and then put it up on YouTube.
Thank you very much. You all are absolutely splendid. What an honor to have this meeting with you. And I'm very grateful and hope we have a face-to-face meeting.
Absolutely.
I'm a deep-dyed Indophile. And I think one of the huge unexplored areas or little underexplored areas on this study of Central Asia is the Indian dimension, which, as I've said throughout this interview, it was actually the most important international link after the Middle East.
We'll start working on it and keep on sending you emails till you block us.
Bravo. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for doing this, Professor. Goodbye. Have a good day ahead.
Goodbye. Goodbye to you all.
So